Neither judo nor jujutsu, nor is it karate. Shorinji Kempo is a martial art created by Doshin. So, who studied judo and kendo from childhood, later encountered Chinese martial arts during a period when they retained a strong, practical, combat-oriented character, and then reorganized and systematized what he had learned after returning to Japan. Combining a unique technical system that integrates both hard techniques, goho, and soft techniques, juho, with a philosophy centered on personal development, it was founded in post-war Japan. Today, it is an unusual martial art that functions not only as a martial arts organization, but also as a religious body based on Kongo Zen. In this video, using Doshin So's own writings as primary references, we will explore his life and the history and philosophy of Shorinji Kempo. So was born in 1911 in a mountainous region of Okayama Prefecture, Japan. His father died of illness when he was still very young, leaving the family burdened with debt. Unable to support her children, his mother was forced to place them in the care of relatives, and So was taken in by his grandfather and brought to Manchuria. According to So, his grandfather was a man who maintained connections with leaders of nationalist movements living in Manchuria. Growing up under his care, Su claimed that he learned various martial arts from him, including judo, spear techniques, and classical jujutsu. Although life in Manchuria was far from wealthy, it was stable enough for him to continue his education, and his grandfather became one of the few emotional anchors in his life. A series of tragedies struck during his late teens. His mother died from illness, followed soon after by the deaths of his two younger sisters. Not long afterward, his grandfather also passed away suddenly. Having lost his entire family while still young, So later described himself as alone in the world. After returning to Japan, he sought support from relatives, but was met with cold treatment. Eventually, he found refuge with the influential nationalist leader Mitsuru Toyama, a longtime acquaintance of his grandfather. Toyama was a prominent figure who maintained relationships with many notable martial artists, including Morihei Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, Takemaru Wakagi, a pioneer of Japanese bodybuilding, and Kanken Toyama, an Okinawan karate master who later served as head of the Shudokan and the former All-Japan Karate-Do Federation, now Renbukai. As a side note, Kanken Toyama's original family name was said to have been Oyadomari, and some accounts claim that he adopted the surname Toyama out of admiration for Mitsuru Toyama's ideals. At the time, Japan was suffering from the effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment was widespread, rural communities struggled with poverty, and factory closures and business failures became increasingly common in urban areas. Overseas markets were shrinking, and a sense of uncertainty and stagnation spread throughout Japanese society. Living in the orbit of Mitsuru Toyama, often regarded as one of the ideological forefathers of Japanese right-wing nationalism, So was exposed to discussions among military officers and nationalist thinkers about Japan's future. Influenced by these conversations, he reportedly decided that he too should serve the nation. He therefore volunteered to participate in activities being secretly organized in Manchuria, and, according to his own account, returned there in 1928. After his grandfather's death, So returned to Manchuria, a place he had once left behind, this time driven by a new sense of purpose. At 18 years old, he understood that the nature of the work he was about to undertake might prevent him from ever returning to Japan. When relatives asked about his future, he reportedly replied, half jokingly and half seriously, "I'm going to China to become the leader of a bandit cavalry." Behind the remark may have been the excitement and determination of a young man preparing to step into an unknown world. The bandit cavalry he referred to were the horse-mounted armed groups known as Mazoku, Ma bandits, that operated throughout Manchuria. Originally formed from bandits, smugglers, refugees, and other displaced people, these groups traveled on horseback, raiding villages and merchant caravans. At times, they also fought for warlords or governments and were occasionally employed as agents or informants by both the Soviet Union and Japan. After arriving in Manchuria, So reported to the organization that had summoned him and was then sent to the Taoist temple Taikingong, located on the outskirts of present-day Shenyang. There he came under the guidance of a Taoist priest known as Master Chen Liang, who maintained cooperative ties with Japanese intelligence agencies. According to So, religious figures could travel more freely and gather information without attracting suspicion, so he was effectively made a disciple of a Taoist priest for practical reasons. Taoism, a religion indigenous to China, developed from the philosophies of Laozi and Zhuangzi while incorporating elements of folk beliefs, immortality cults, and Buddhism. Deeply woven into everyday Chinese life, it provided So with what he later described as his first true gateway to understanding Chinese culture. So also described Master Chen Liang as a former military officer of the Qing dynasty who had studied in Japan. Though small in stature, he possessed piercing eyes and spoke Japanese fluently. In So's recollections, Master Chen later emerges as the first major figure who introduced him to the world of Chinese martial arts. According to So, he did not travel to China simply to learn martial arts. Rather, it was through immersing himself in Chinese society, living alongside Chinese people, and experiencing China's religions and philosophies firsthand that he eventually encountered the martial traditions that would shape the rest of his life. According to So, after entering the Taoist temple Taikingong in Manchuria, his days were consumed by learning Chinese and adapting to life in the temple. One day his teacher, Master Chen Liang, took him to a branch of the Red Swastika Society, World Red Swastika Society. During a casual conversation with several people there, So unexpectedly found himself being tested on his martial abilities. Having studied judo and classical jujutsu since childhood and possessing confidence in both his physique and strength, So believed himself to be a highly capable martial artist. Yet when he attempted to move a hand that Master Chen had casually placed on a table, he could not budge it at all. When he then tried to apply a technique, he was effortlessly thrown. What made the experience even more shocking was that his opponent was a small man, well over 60 years old. He continued to challenge the old master, first through judo grappling and eventually with direct attacks, but each attempt was easily neutralized. Years later, So still described this complete defeat as one of the most unforgettable shocks of his youth. What astonished him most was the realization that there existed methods that could not be explained by the principles of judo as he understood them. Here was a system that relied neither on strength nor size, but on using an opponent's force against them. The moment contact was made, one's balance could be broken through seemingly mysterious means. The moment contact was made, one's balance could be broken through seemingly mysterious means. According to So, it was during this encounter that he first learned of the existence of Kempo and realized that there was an entirely different martial world beyond the Japanese arts he had studied. Afterward, Master Chen reportedly revealed that he was a senior member of a secret society known as Zaikarri and a master of White Lotus Gate boxing, a tradition said to trace its origins to Shaolin. Following the suppression that came after the Boxer Rebellion, many boxing traditions had gone underground, but according to So, their teachings had continued to survive in secrecy. From that point onward, he devoted himself to the study of Chinese boxing. The training, however, was nothing like the structured martial arts systems of the modern era. There were no manuals, no organized curriculum, and no clearly defined technical system. The master demonstrated a technique, and the student learned it through direct physical experience. By being thrown, locked, struck, and corrected repeatedly, So gradually absorbed the principles behind the movements. He later recalled assigning Japanese names to techniques and organizing them in his own notes to aid his memory. It is possible that the systematic terminology and theoretical framework that later characterized Shorinji Kempo were rooted in these early experiences. Perhaps because of his martial arts background from childhood, So believed he progressed unusually quickly. While an average student might learn only one lesson from 10 teachings, he claimed he could grasp one lesson from a single teaching and eventually come to understand two from hearing one. During this period, So remembered himself as more than a martial arts student. He was also a young intelligence operative traveling throughout Manchuria. As Japanese activities in Manchuria intensified following the Huangutun incident, he and his associates were tasked with making contact with influential local figures and former Qing officials. Their travels took them across northeastern China and deep into North China. Among all his experiences, what left the strongest impression on So was the vast network of the secret society known as Zaikarri, which he claimed extended throughout China. According to him, its members came from every social class: soldiers, government officials, merchants, craftsmen, and many others. Because the organization was founded upon shared religious beliefs, its internal bonds were exceptionally strong, and local branches maintained extensive networks throughout the country. The society also possessed its own elaborate system of identification and discipline. Members reportedly used special questions and answers, coded gestures, and even specific ways of arranging eating utensils to verify one another's identities. To So, it felt like stepping into a world reminiscent of ninja traditions or secret brotherhoods, giving him the sense that he had glimpsed a hidden layer of Chinese society. In his view, these secret societies were not merely underground organizations. Rather, they functioned as popular self-defense associations within Chinese society. During revolutions and political upheavals, they sometimes emerged into public view, while in more peaceful times they continued to support local communities. Most important of all, however, were the martial artists he encountered during these journeys. Traveling with Master Chen, So was able to meet and learn from a small number of surviving masters of traditional Chinese boxing. At Qianshan in Liaoyang, he studied Neo-Ken under monk Shuifang. In Hong Kong, he witnessed techniques associated with the White Lotus tradition. In Hubei, he encountered Meihua Quan. In Hainan, Buddhist family boxing. And in Hebei, boxing traditions associated with the Yang family. Yet the reality was somewhat different from what he had imagined. Many of the practitioners were already elderly, and in numerous cases only a handful of techniques remained. Due to the suppression that followed the Boxer Rebellion and the passage of time, martial systems that had once been comprehensive traditions survived only in fragmented form. So later described this period as a journey to gather the scattered fragments of a disappearing martial art. At the same time, he was confronted by the gap between his youthful ideals and reality. Before leaving for China, he had imagined a life filled with the daring exploits of mounted bandits and the thrill of secret operations. The reality, however, was very different. Endless marches on foot, harsh living conditions, and days without even the opportunity to bathe. Eventually, exhaustion set in, and he began to question whether this was truly the path he wanted to follow. If he was going to risk his life, perhaps there was a more glorious calling. With that thought, So returned to Japan and applied to join the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. Fortunately, he was accepted and began training as a pilot with the Kakamigahara Air Regiment. He believed that flying was his true destiny. That dream, however, was short-lived. During training, he fell ill and was hospitalized. He was ultimately diagnosed with valvular heart disease and discharged from military service. His future as an aviation officer vanished almost overnight. With no family to rely on, no property, and no place to call home, he found himself at a loss. When he sought advice from a senior acquaintance, he was reportedly told, "If you're prepared to die anyway, go back to Manchuria." And so, for the third time, So made the decision to return to Manchuria. After returning, So resumed both his recovery and his martial arts training under Chen Liang Laoshi. Around this time, Beijing was said to be home to Wen Taizong Laoshi, the legitimate successor of Northern Shaolin Yihemen boxing. Through Chen's introduction, So was formally accepted as a disciple and began intensive training in the system. According to So's account, Wen was one of the few individuals who had inherited traditions dating back to before the Boxer Rebellion and possessed advanced teachings that included Longhua Quan, Wuhua Quan, and Luohan Quan. Thanks to his keen understanding and dedication, So progressed rapidly, reportedly impressing both his teacher and senior students. Wen was said to have been delighted to find a successor to an art he feared would disappear with his own generation, and he reportedly treated So like a son. For his part, So became deeply captivated by both his teacher's character and his martial knowledge, immersing himself in the study of boxing traditions. It should be noted, however, that no definitive Chinese historical sources confirming the existence of Wen Taizong have been discovered to date. To better understand the environment in which So trained, it is worth briefly examining the Boxer Rebellion mentioned earlier. As a result, modern researchers generally regard Wen Taizong as a figure whose historical existence remains unverified. In the late 19th century, China was increasingly penetrated by Western powers and Japan. Christian missionary activity expanded rapidly, and foreign nations gained growing economic and political influence throughout the country. In response to these changes, a martial arts society known as the Yihequan, Righteous and Harmonious Fists, gained popularity among peasants and craftsmen. Its members believed that through rigorous training they could acquire extraordinary powers, and they rose up with the goal of expelling foreigners and defending China. Practitioners of Yihequan believed that if divine spirits entered their bodies, they would become immune to swords and bullets. According to contemporary accounts, Boxer members sought to obtain this power not only through martial arts training, but also through rituals, incantations, the use of charms, and spirit possession ceremonies. Over time, the movement evolved into a large-scale uprising known as the Boxer movement. Its members attacked Christian missionaries, Chinese converts to Christianity, and facilities associated with foreign interests. For a time, elements within the Qing government supported them, seeing the movement as a means of resisting foreign influence. However, when the Eight-Nation Alliance, composed of Japan, Britain, Russia, Germany, France, the United States, and other powers, intervened with modern armies and advanced weaponry, the Boxers, armed mainly with swords, spears, and traditional martial arts, were overwhelmed by disciplined troops equipped with modern firearms. The rebellion was crushed in 1900. The Boxer Rebellion was, in essence, a conflict in which ordinary Chinese people trained in martial arts rose up to defend their country amid the pressures of modernization and foreign domination, only to find themselves confronting the military power of the world's leading nations. It was among these fading martial traditions and martial arts cultures that So later pursued his own training and study. In 1936, So traveled with Wen Laoshi and Chen Laoshi to the famous Shaolin Temple on Mount Song in Henan Province. There he saw ancient sites associated with Bodhidharma, as well as buildings that still testified to the temple's former glory. Yet the martial traditions themselves had already declined, and much of the vitality that once characterized Shaolin had faded away. According to So's later accounts, it was at Shaolin Temple that he underwent a ceremonial transmission of the Yihemen boxing lineage and was formally recognized as a successor to the tradition. At the time, however, So had no intention of bringing Chinese boxing to Japan. He did not believe that Japan would lose the war, nor did he expect to return home permanently. He intended to spend the rest of his life in China. To him, martial arts were simply a fascinating and profound discipline, and his motivation for training was largely a desire to live up to the expectations of the teachers he deeply respected. Fate, however, would take an unexpected turn. In 1945, Japan's defeat became a reality, and Soviet forces invaded Manchuria. With the assistance of Chinese friends and members of secret societies with whom he had connections, So managed to escape through the chaos and dangers of the collapsing wartime environment. Although this departs briefly from the story of Doshin So, it is worth examining the road to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria through the lens of Japanese martial arts history. On the night of September 18, 1931, a small explosion occurred near the tracks of the South Manchuria Railway in northeastern China. The damage was minimal and train operations were barely affected. Nevertheless, Japan's Kanto Army announced that the sabotage had been carried out by Chinese forces. The Kanto Army immediately launched military operations, advancing into Mukden, present-day Shenyang, and other parts of Manchuria. Under normal circumstances, such military action required authorization from the government in Tokyo. However, the Kanto Army leadership, led by Kanji Ishihara, chose not to wait for approval. At the time, Japan was suffering from the effects of the Great Depression. Many believed that Manchuria represented a vast source of resources and a promising market for Japanese expansion. Officers within the Kanto Army argued that securing Manchuria was essential to Japan's future survival. Subsequent investigations would strongly suggest that the explosion had in fact been orchestrated by members of the Kanto Army itself. By then, however, most of Manchuria had already fallen under Japanese control. In 1932, Japan established the state of Manchukuo in northeastern China as a direct consequence of the Manchurian incident. One of the principal architects of the new state was Kanto Army officer Kanji Ishihara, who promoted an idealistic vision based on the concept of harmony of the five races. The last emperor of the Qing dynasty, Aisin Puyi, was installed as the nominal head of state, although real authority remained firmly in the hands of the Kanto Army. Despite his central role in the creation of Manchukuo, Ishihara maintained that no race was inherently superior to another. As a result, he attracted supporters among some Koreans living under Japanese rule, including figures associated with the martial arts world. Among them was So Nei-chu, a Korean practitioner and teacher of Mazoyama connected to Goju-ryu karate, who later became one of Ishihara's close associates. Another passionate supporter was Kyozaburo Fukushima, a judo instructor at both the Dai Nippon Butokukai's Martial Arts College and Manchukuo's Kenkoku University. Fukushima is remembered as the teacher of Masahiko Kimura, the legendary judoka who later defeated Helio Gracie. Tatsukuma Ushijima, a fellow judoka and junior of Fukushima, was likewise sympathetic to Ishihara's ideas. The Goju-ryu karate master Gogen Yamaguchi was also closely connected to many of these martial artists. According to later accounts, Yamaguchi's intelligence-related activities in Manchuria were undertaken at Ishihara's direct request. Although Ishihara had helped create Manchukuo, he opposed a full-scale war with China and remained cautious about the prospect of war with the United States. His repeated clashes with Prime Minister Hideki Tojo over military policy eventually led to his removal from positions of influence. By the way, in 1938, the state of Manchukuo established the Kenkoku University, National Foundation University, as an elite institution to educate its future leaders. Under the ideal of harmony of the five races, Japanese, Manchu, Chinese, Korean, and Mongolian students lived and studied together. One of the central pillars of the curriculum was martial arts, with judo, kendo, and aikibudo adopted as compulsory subjects. Aikibudo in particular gained considerable popularity among the students. Its advisor was Morihei Ueshiba, while instruction was provided by Kenji Tomiki. Kenkoku University was an experimental educational institution that sought to promote ethnic harmony and character development. However, these ideals existed within the political reality of Manchukuo, a state ultimately led and controlled by Japan. Martial arts demonstrations were also frequently held throughout Manchukuo. In 1938, Tenryu Saburo, a former sumo wrestler serving as executive director of the Manchukuo Martial Arts Association, organized a large public martial arts exhibition to introduce Japanese martial traditions to Manchukuo's government officials. He invited many of the leading martial artists of the era, including Morihei Ueshiba, Sasaburo Takano, and Hakudo Nakayama, along with renowned experts in kendo, judo, Kyudo, and other disciplines. One well-known anecdote comes from a demonstration held in Xinjiang in 1939. During the event, Morihei Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, reportedly threw the former sumo sekiwake Tenryu. At the time, Tenryu was 34 years old, and during his active career, stood 187 centimeters tall and weighed 116 kilos. Ueshiba, by contrast, was 55 years old. This is usually how it be. Looking further back, in 1924, when Ueshiba was 41, he accompanied Onisaburo Deguchi, the charismatic leader of the new religious movement Omoto, on an expedition to Manchuria. The group sought to establish a religious state in Mongolia. With arrangements made through a special agency of the Kanto army, they joined the forces of the bandit leader Lu Jiangkui, who served under the Manchurian warlord Zhang Zuolin. As they traveled toward Mongolia, Zhang Zuolin became suspicious of Lu's intentions. Through a series of political maneuvers, the expedition repeatedly found itself in mortal danger. Nearby Yintala, in present-day Jilin province, the group was captured by troops loyal to the Chinese central government and the Fengtian army. They were taken to Tongliao, where Lu Jiangkui and many of his followers were executed by firing squad. Deguchi, Ueshiba, and 6 other Japanese members of the expedition were also led to the execution grounds and believed their deaths were imminent. However, after urgent negotiations by officials from the Japanese consulate, the executions were halted at the last moment. These episodes illustrate that a number of prominent Japanese martial artists were active in Manchuria during this period, where martial arts, politics, diplomacy, and ideological movements often intersected in complex and dramatic ways. By the end of the Second World War, approximately 1.5 million Japanese civilians lived in Manchuria. They included farmers from settlement colonies, shopkeepers, railway employees, teachers, and their families. Their fate changed dramatically in the early hours of August 9, 1945, when the Soviet Union violated the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. Japanese leaders had expected neutrality with the Soviet Union to continue. Furthermore, many of the Kanto Army's best units had already been transferred to China and the Pacific theaters. Soviet forces rapidly broke through weakened defensive lines, and the Kanto Army collapsed with astonishing speed. Little capacity remained to protect civilian populations. Abandoned civilians fled south with whatever possessions they could carry. Railways descended into chaos, roads became clogged with refugees, and shortages of food and water were widespread. Starvation and disease spread quickly. Children died in their parents' arms, while many elderly people were left behind along the roadsides. In several regions, fear of the advancing Soviet army and the collapse of public order led to incidents of mass suicide. Young women faced the constant threat of violence. Large numbers of Japanese men were taken to Siberia, where they were subjected to years of harsh labor in mines, logging camps, and construction projects. The Soviet government regarded this forced labor as a form of compensation for wartime destruction. Amid the confusion, countless children became separated from their parents. Many were adopted by Chinese families and raised as Chinese. A large number grew up unaware of their Japanese origins. Decades later, they became known as the Japanese war orphans left behind in China. Even after the war ended, immediate repatriation was impossible. Refugee camps suffered from food shortages and infectious diseases, claiming many additional lives. Some survivors eventually returned to Japan aboard repatriation ships, but the journey home was often long and agonizing. It is estimated that between 200,000 and 300,000 Japanese civilians died during the evacuation and repatriation from Manchuria. For people who believed that peace would arrive the moment the war ended, what awaited them instead was a new chapter of suffering. Alongside the civilian tragedy of the Battle of Okinawa, the Manchurian repatriation remains one of the greatest humanitarian disasters experienced by the Japanese people during the final stages of the war and the immediate post-war period. Its memory continues to be passed down to this day. At the same time, another martial artist who had been engaged in special intelligence work in Manchuria, much like So Doshin, was the Goju-Ryu karate master Gogen Yamaguchi. After being captured by Soviet forces, Yamaguchi was subjected to harsh interrogation by the Soviet state security authorities before being transferred to a brutal prisoner of war camp in Siberia. There he endured years of extreme cold, hunger, and grueling forced labor carried out with little regard for human rights. In some camps, prisoners were also subjected to ideological education based on Marxism-Leninism. Despite the desperate conditions, where an estimated 55,000 Japanese internees perished from starvation and exposure, Yamaguchi survived through extraordinary physical endurance and mental resilience. He is said to have continually encouraged fellow prisoners and eventually regained his freedom after approximately 2 years. Now let us return to the story of So Doshin. During his flight from the collapsing front, So witnessed humanity at its most extreme. Some people trampled others in a desperate struggle for survival, while others sacrificed themselves to help those around them. Through these experiences, he came to a profound realization. A person's true worth is not determined by education, status, or social standing, but by the quality of their character. The trauma of defeat and the suffering he witnessed transformed So. What had once been merely a martial artist began to evolve into a thinker who placed the development of human character at the center of his life's mission. After passing through a series of brutal internment camps, So and his men finally arrived at a camp facing Lianshan Bay. The buildings were surrounded by heavily guarded barbed wire fences, while Chinese soldiers stood watch with fixed bayonets, their eyes constantly scanning the prisoners. 50 people were crammed into 2 small rooms measuring only 6 and 4.5 tatami mats. There was not even enough space to lie down. The food ration was meager, and the conditions were beyond description. One day, the battalion commander reluctantly broke the silence.
A request has come from Staff Officer Zhou of the Chinese Transportation Headquarters. He wants 3 young women to assist at a banquet tonight.
Whether the repatriation group would be allowed to board a ship remained uncertain. If Staff Officer Zhou were offended, their return to Japan could be delayed by weeks, and they might be subjected to further harsh labor details. The battalion commander believed that selecting several attractive young women would secure favorable treatment and improve their chances of returning home. Some officers suggested choosing former prostitutes and compensating them with money, but So fiercely opposed the idea. The debate reached a stalemate. Unable to reach a decision, the company commanders returned to their quarters to consult their men. According to rumors, the same demand was being made every time a repatriation group arrived. If they complied again, the practice would likely continue indefinitely. Perhaps resisting now could spare future groups from facing the same ordeal. The choice was not an easy one.
Should they sacrifice a few individuals to secure their own safety and return home carrying the burden of regret? Or should they resist, knowing it could result in delays, punishment, or worse?
Prepared to accept responsibility for whatever followed, So left the decision to his men. After a long silence, one man stood up and shouted,
"Let's stay. Let's not hand over the women."
His words spread through the room almost instantly.
Let's stay.
Let's refuse.
Voices of support rose one after another until the entire company stood united. Together, they resolved to reject the demand. So then proposed another approach. Since there were restrictions on the amount of money each repatriate could bring back to Japan, those with extra funds pooled their resources. With this money, representatives would visit headquarters and attempt to negotiate a different solution. It was a gamble. Yet the negotiations succeeded far more smoothly than anyone had expected. Several days later, when they finally reached the dock, they saw an American transport ship anchored at the pier, flying the Japanese flag. The sight overwhelmed many of them. Tears began to flow. Soon sobs could be heard throughout the crowd. At last their long ordeal was coming to an end. Many Japanese civilians in Manchuria endured similar hardships during this period. The tense details of the negotiations have been omitted here, but compared to many others, So's case was relatively fortunate and ended with an unusually peaceful resolution. The experience left a profound impression on him. He came to believe that when a single person acts with courage and conviction, it is possible to change the fate of many others. It was a lesson he learned firsthand amid the chaos of the post-war years, and one that would profoundly shape the course of his life after returning to Japan. In mid-June 1951, the repatriation ship carrying So arrived safely at the port of Sasebo in Nagasaki Prefecture. Amid the confusion that followed the war, So had nowhere in particular to go. For the time being, he decided to head toward his mother's hometown and boarded a train designated for repatriates. After some time, the train stopped at a large station. Suddenly, several young men forced their way aboard. They appeared to belong to groups of Taiwanese or Koreans from territories that had once been under Japanese colonial rule. Having been liberated from Japanese rule at the end of the war, some among these communities were said to have caused disturbances in various places, contributing to the breakdown of public order during the chaotic post-war years. The men pushed passengers aside, occupied seats, and glared threateningly at those around them. Everyone was uncomfortable, yet not a single person spoke up. In those early post-war years, Japanese society was still deeply affected by the shock of defeat and the turmoil that followed. Most people preferred to remain silent and avoid trouble. Before long, one of the men attempted to lie down on the luggage rack above the seats. To make room, he began carelessly throwing passengers' belongings onto the floor. One of the falling bags struck a woman holding a small child. Startled, the child burst into tears. At that moment, something inside So snapped. The martial arts he had practiced for many years took over naturally.
Why does no one speak up? Why? Even when someone is suffering right before our eyes, do we tell ourselves that it is enough as long as we are not affected? If we are to survive in the years ahead, those of us who remain must help one another.
Most people are not cowards. They have simply lost the opportunity or the spark to be the first to stand up. As he observed post-war Japanese society, So found himself thinking more deeply about this truth. To rebuild a nation, political systems and institutions alone are not enough. What must be rebuilt first are the people themselves. No matter how well-designed a system may be, society cannot function if the people who support it lack courage, responsibility, and conviction. Conversely, if more individuals develop a strong sense of purpose, a nation can always recover. At the same time, Su understood that idealistic speeches alone would not attract young people. He therefore decided to use the martial art he had devoted himself to since his youth as a gateway. First, he would draw people in through the appeal of martial arts. Then, through the process of mastering techniques, they would gain confidence. From there, he could teach them a broader philosophy of life, society, and how to live as responsible human beings. He believed that true education must cultivate both body and mind. Thus, in post-war Kagawa Prefecture, a small martial arts dojo was established. So taught self-defense techniques with great dedication, hoping to give young people the confidence to believe, "I can do this too." But technical training was only part of his mission. He repeatedly emphasized the importance of helping others, taking responsibility for society, and valuing one's community and comrades. Yet his efforts were far from smooth. Japan was still under Allied occupation, and strict restrictions had been placed on martial arts education. Various regulations also limited public gatherings. As long as the dojo remained small, it attracted little attention. But as the number of students grew, it became increasingly visible, and continuing its activities became more difficult. So began to feel that his movement would need to evolve into something greater than a mere martial arts organization if it was to survive and fulfill its purpose. As the number of disciples increased, so did So's concerns. How could he ensure that his ideals would continue long after him? One night, while wrestling with this question, he experienced something unusual. In a dream, an old man appeared before him. It was none other than Bodhidharma, the revered founder of Chan Zen Buddhism in China. Bodhidharma spoke to him calmly. When So awoke, he felt a profound sense of certainty. Until then, he had focused primarily on transmitting martial techniques. Yet the teachings associated with Shaolin were never merely methods of combat. They were a path of self-cultivation, a discipline through which one refined one's character by training the body. If that were true, then perhaps the spiritual dimension should be brought to the forefront. Under the occupation authorities' principle of religious freedom, it might be possible to establish an organization centered on the teachings of Bodhidharma and pursue its mission as a spiritual training movement. So wasted no time. He began the process of establishing a religious corporation and formally positioned his activities as a Buddhist-based training organization. He also explained his intentions to the occupation authorities responsible for civil affairs. We are not an organization that trains people for violence. We are a group that studies the spirit of Bodhidharma and seeks to cultivate character through physical discipline. These explanations were ultimately accepted. Soon afterward, So became acquainted with a Zen priest who served as the abbot of a temple in Kyoto and eventually became his disciple in the Buddhist lineage. Then, in 1951, with the enactment of Japan's Religious Corporations Act, So's organization entered a new phase. Under the name Kongo Zen Sohonzan Shorinji, head temple of Shorinji, it was officially re-established as a religious corporation, marking the beginning of a new chapter in its history. Spring 1948, back when Shorinji Kempo was still virtually unknown to the public.
Good morning!
Is Master So here?
That would be me.
Oh? So you're the master?
Well then, please come in.
The man took a seat and began speaking about his martial art. He spoke of the history of Aikijutsu, its lineage, and the legends surrounding the masters of past generations. The stories went on and on. There were tales of masters who subdued multiple opponents in an instant, of giant sumo wrestlers being effortlessly thrown, and even of warriors who moved before an armed opponent could fire. Doshin So listened quietly. Whether the stories were exaggerated or whether the man truly possessed such skill, he could not tell. Yet out of respect for a martial artist who had devoted many years to training, he listened attentively to each account without interruption. At last the man came to the point.
Show me the techniques of Shorinji Kempo.
Shorinji Kempo is not a martial art practiced for inter-school matches or to compete for victory and defeat. It is not meant to defeat others, but to train oneself and grow as a human being. For that reason, its techniques cannot be demonstrated to those who are not formally initiated students.
I've come all this way to visit you. Surely you could make an exception and show us at least one technique. Please.
If you desire it that strongly, then I will make a special exception and show you. I would like to see the techniques of the Akijitsu, in which you take such pride.
Very well. Then allow me to demonstrate my technique first. Go ahead and attack me however you like. However, if I apply a technique and you try to resist it, you may break a bone. So when the technique takes effect, simply fall.
The challenging attitude he had shown when he first arrived had disappeared, and he offered a respectful apology. Thus, the events of that day came to an end. Martial artists seeking to test their skills against So began appearing one after another. One day, a man with experience in judo visited the dojo. The man explained that he had served in China during the war and had even sparred with individuals reputed to be masters of Chinese martial arts. Having been able to throw one such practitioner with little difficulty, he seemed to hold Chinese martial arts in rather low regard. After listening to him, So concluded that words alone would not be enough to make his point and invited the man into the dojo. The man was completely subdued and ultimately had no choice but to admit defeat. However, So did not use such incidents as evidence that Shorinji Kempo was superior to judo or any other martial art. He believed that each martial art possessed its own purpose and theoretical foundation, and that simply comparing them in terms of superiority or inferiority was ultimately meaningless. Judo had its own value, Aikido had its own value. Shorinji Kempo, he maintained, was merely one among them. Yet the reality of the time was that once a dojo opened its doors, challengers would inevitably appear. If one chose to put up a signboard and teach a martial art, one had to demonstrate its worth in practice. This was especially true for Shorinji Kempo in its infancy, a new martial art with neither an established reputation nor any notable achievements to its name. Had Doshin So himself been defeated, people might easily have concluded that Shorinji Kempo is only as good as that. For that reason, he sometimes dealt firmly with those who came to challenge him. Looking back on those days years later, So remarked,
"Every day was a series of serious contests.
The origins of Shorinji Kempo can be traced to the ancient Shaolin Temple in China's Henan province. Although the Shaolin Temple is widely known as the birthplace of martial arts, its training was never intended solely as a means of defeating opponents. Rather, it evolved as a system for strengthening both body and mind, maintaining health, and cultivating one's spirit. So believed that this tradition ultimately dated back to the Buddhist practices of ancient India. Monks trained their bodies to endure long hours of meditation and the hardships of monastic life. They also needed the ability to defend themselves against wild animals and to protect the temple from bandits seeking to steal valuable Buddhist statues and other treasures. In this way, a unique discipline emerged in which physical training and spiritual cultivation became inseparable. However, the defining characteristic of Shorinji Kempo is not merely the sophistication of its techniques. What So emphasized time and again was the true meaning of the character Bu. When people hear the term martial arts, they often imagine techniques designed to overpower an opponent. Yet in ancient Chinese thought, Bu did not signify a love of conflict. Instead, it represented the power to prevent violence, restore peace, and protect others. Force exists not to destroy but to preserve order. The Chinese character for Bu is traditionally interpreted as to stop the spear. True strength should never be used to dominate others, but to give people a sense of security. This philosophy formed the very foundation of Shorinji Kempo. For that reason, Shorinji Kempo teaches practitioners never to initiate violence. Rather than striking first, its emphasis is on protecting oneself, responding appropriately to an attack, and bringing the situation under control. In prehistoric times, superiority was determined largely by physical size and brute strength. As civilization developed, however, people learned to overcome their weaknesses through ingenuity and technique. Martial arts follow the same principle. True self-defense is not a contest of raw power. Even those who are physically smaller or weaker can protect themselves by mastering techniques based on sound principles. So taught that this is where the true value of martial arts lies. Above all, however, strength itself must never become the ultimate goal. No matter how refined one's techniques may become, if they lead to arrogance or contempt for others, one has strayed from the true spirit of Budo. Conversely, when a person disciplines themselves, helps others, and strives to contribute to society, their martial skills become a force for protecting people rather than harming them. So's objective was never simply to create strong fighters. His goal was to cultivate individuals who possessed both strength and compassion. That was the true ideal of Shorinji Kempo, and the genuine purpose behind his efforts to spread its teachings in the turbulent years following the Second World War. In the post-war era, the martial arts world became increasingly focused on sport, where victory and defeat came to define success. Winners were praised. Losers received little recognition. As competitive sports, this was only natural, and many martial arts flourished through the development of competition. Yet So questioned this trend. If winning becomes the sole objective, what then is the true purpose of training? He pointed to examples in which young athletes, blessed with superior physical strength, could easily overpower older instructors. In doing so, he highlighted the limitations of pursuing physical strength alone. With age, everyone's physical abilities inevitably decline. Even the finest instructor may eventually be at a disadvantage in a contest of pure athleticism against a younger opponent. But can the value of martial arts really be measured by that alone? To So, martial arts were never something to be judged solely by victory or defeat. Their purpose was to foster personal growth, to cultivate self-discipline, to develop individuals capable of making meaningful contributions to society. These too were essential aspects of the true spirit of martial arts. For this reason, Shorinji Kempo places greater importance on training together, refining one's techniques through mutual practice, and growing alongside one's partners than on defeating an opponent in competition. So was also critical of the traditional methods of martial arts instruction that he himself had experienced in his youth. In the kendo training of his childhood, technical principles were seldom explained in detail. Instead, beginners were expected to learn by repeatedly being struck by their seniors. Judo training followed much the same pattern. Students gained experience primarily by being thrown over and over again, with practical experience taking precedence over systematic instruction. According to a story So heard directly from his grandfather, the latter had studied a school of traditional Japanese jujutsu in his youth. Among its training methods was an exercise intended to make practitioners more resistant to losing consciousness when being strangled. The method, however, was extraordinarily severe. Every day, the trainees performed exercises that closely resembled hanging. At first, they used thick ropes padded with cotton, but as their bodies adapted, the ropes were gradually replaced with thinner ones. The training left permanent marks on his grandfather's neck. When So was a child, his grandfather showed him the scars and remarked with a wry smile,
"Looking back, it was a rather foolish thing to do. The scars stayed with me, and for a while I was even embarrassed to appear in public."
Years later, after his grandfather began studying atami, vital point-striking techniques, his perspective on such training changed. To render an opponent unconscious through strangulation, no matter how skillfully applied, requires a certain amount of time. A precise strike to a vital point, however, can stop an opponent's movement almost instantly. He came to feel that the most practical techniques were taught only after many years of training, and that much of the preceding hardship had been an unnecessary detour. That said, So did not believe that all traditional methods of rigorous training were meaningless. Severe discipline can undoubtedly cultivate perseverance and mental fortitude. Nevertheless, he observed that the martial arts world often imposed unnecessarily difficult challenges or structured training so that mastery would take many years to achieve. Similar tendencies could also be found in various traditional Japanese arts and systems of self-cultivation. A well-known example is found in the world of sushi. There is an old saying, 3 years to master cooking rice, 8 years to master making sushi. According to this traditional apprenticeship, only after years of performing menial tasks could one finally earn the title of sushi chef. Such stories are often celebrated as admirable examples of dedication. So, however, argued that what truly matters is identifying what actually contributes to achieving one's objective. The real value of training lies not in its severity, but in understanding the purpose behind each exercise and the results it is intended to produce. This, he believed, is one of the most important principles in the study of martial arts. At the time, demonstrations such as breaking roof tiles or bricks with one's fists or wrestling with large animals were often regarded as proof of martial prowess. So referred to the story of a famous karate master who spent years training in the mountains to strengthen his fists and knife hand strikes. Having perfected these skills, he demonstrated spectacular feats of breaking roof tiles and bricks. During overseas tours, however, he reportedly found that the building materials used abroad were much harder than those in Japan, making such demonstrations considerably more difficult. According to So, the true purpose of martial arts is not to destroy objects. Roof tiles and bricks are created to support buildings. Their value lies not in being broken, but in fulfilling the purpose for which they were made. Likewise, if one's goal is to bring down a bull, there are far more efficient methods than years of martial arts training. Years later, the karate master, known for his practical combat-oriented philosophy, responded to So's criticism.
You don't have to break a bull's horns, but at least break a goat's horns before you speak.
So simply concluded that they were pursuing fundamentally different ideals.
There is little point in continuing this discussion, he remarked, believing that any further debate would only run in parallel without resolution.
The karate master, for his part, frequently criticized martial arts that emphasized spiritual cultivation or avoided full contact striking, arguing that they lacked genuine combative value. It is an exchange that invites us to reflect on a fundamental question. What is martial arts truly for? So also observed that if learning martial arts required spending many years merely to master tile breaking, brick breaking, or techniques for defeating bulls, few people in the modern world would find such a path appealing. As mentioned earlier, in the post-war era, many Japanese martial arts increasingly evolved into competitive sports. At the same time, Jigoro Kano transformed what had originally been martial techniques for subduing an opponent into Budo, a discipline aimed at the cultivation of character and the development of the individual. In contrast, Doshin refused to follow the prevailing trends of his time. Through his study of Chinese martial arts and Buddhist philosophy, he sought to pursue and preserve this ideal even further. It may therefore be said that he was one of the few who remained committed to safeguarding the original spirit of Japanese Budo in its truest sense.